Listen only mode.
Thank you for joining us. My name is Bill Baker at Firestorm. We're delighted that you're able to join us for this webinar today. Today, we've got Dr. Robert Chandler with us again. In the final of the 6 stages, the stage 6, the recovery phase. We also invite you to become our friend at Firestorm. On Facebook, we're known as Firestorm Solutions. On Twitter, we're Firestorm Soul. There is a hashtag, and that hashtag is Crisis Coach. Firestorm transforms crisis into value. Firestorm empowers you to manage risk and crises. Firestorm expertise is crisis management, critical decision support, crisis communications, crisis public relations, and consequence management. Our attorneys make us use this disclaimer. The presentation today is not complete without the accompanying oral comments and discussion. In addition, this information should be considered and read with guidance from your organization's personal counsel. And this information should not be considered or interpreted as legal advice or legal opinion. Our presenters today is our very own Jim Satterfield, president of Firestorm, along with Dr. Robert Chandler. Jim, over to you, please.
Well, good day, everybody. And Bob, great to have you back. Bob and I were at the DRJ, I guess, about a week ago now, as the time flies when you're having fun category. And we're glad to be finishing up this series. And I know we've had hundreds of companies attend, and there's been a lot of interest and enthusiasm there. I think anytime you can get Dr. Chandler's insight into what you need to be doing becomes very important. I also think that this series continues to be emphasized with the events that go on around us. The shootings at the community colleges out in Oregon, again, drove us with the idea of getting messages and the right message at each one of the stages of a crisis to come through. And we've been seeing the water damage that came along the coast, in particular South Carolina, and I know many of you have listened to Karen Mazzullo in our webinars and talking about what we need to do from an intelligence network and monitoring social media and those factors. And Karen's house sustained water damage as a result of these events. So it's, at the end of the day, the statement that all crises, every crisis is a human crisis, really gets emphasized again. And I think it's such an important element for us to focus on and to talk about today. This is the stage 6, the recovery phase. And Bob, when he starts talking, will show you that these phases overlap, as you see from the illustration that he has here. And I think it's been a helpful one to help us focus our communications at each step along the way. And I know we'll have some additional thoughts that I'd like to share, but Bob, we've got the recovery phase here listed number 6 in big and bold. Anything you want to say as we start this?
Well, yeah, thank you, Jim. And I'm a little worried about Karen down there with all the flooding in South Carolina. You're absolutely right. The headlines just continue to remind us of the criticality of having a communication plan. Our hearts are broken this week with yet another school shooting, but we're encouraged. But now we have 2 planned school shootings that were disrupted in advance, and I'm just always reminded of how important it is to be vigilant and to get that information out there. Yeah, go ahead.
And I was just going to add in the point that you just made about the 2 that were thwarted. If you don't have an intelligence network, if you haven't designed one of those within your school or your business, the statistics are, if there's someone who has ill intent, 80% of the time there's someone else who knows, and 67% of the time there are 2 or more people that know. And we can talk about communicating in the crisis all we want, but Bob and I both would rather you never had a crisis that we had to talk about. And I would a lot rather explain that you uncovered this early in the process instead of what are we going to do now that it's happening.
No, that's excellent. You're absolutely right. And to the extent we can prevent, we can mitigate, I mean, all of those are very important things. We concede that some things are inevitable, and again, just scrolling down my news feeds here, we've got an Amtrak train that's apparently derailed today. We've lost a container ship at sea. We've got there's always something. And so what we're going to do today is really talk about the last phase, although some people call it the never-ending phase. People have nicknamed it that, and that is it's stage 6 of a crisis life cycle, which is recovery. And so in a very real sense, this is the stage, this is the one we want to get to, which means that we have resolved the issue, or at least has terminated and expired, and that we have resolved the crisis one way or the other. And this is, to some degree, the long slog. This is the hard work of saying, okay, now what next, and what we're doing. And so getting back to normal is the real goal here. And so the 6th phase of a life cycle is putting the pieces back together. And actually, best practices dictate that we're wanting to get back to whatever the new normal is, or back to usual. And it's difficult to do. Believe it or not, in the aftermath of an event of various levels, the situation has changed. Factors have changed. People have changed. Processes have changed. I would like to believe that we always learn from these events, so we deliberately make some changes, but there are inevitable changes that happen that are both functional and dysfunctional that we have to adjust to. And so this is not, and many people will say, well, Bob, don't we just switch back to the way things were before? And the answer I have to give after lots of practice, lots of experience, and lots of study is that no, you can't just say, let's just flip back the chart and do what we did before, because in many ways, some of them subtle, some of them very in-your-face pragmatic, the situation has changed, whether it's suppliers or vendors or your own employees or customers and facilities and operation procedures and changes in the law and changes in the infrastructure. You have to adapt. And so planning the recovery phase communication is just as vital and critical for your continuity of operations, for your sustainability as an organization, a business, a company, a hospital, a school, as any other stage. This is not the last and therefore least. And I'm hesitant to say it's last but most important, but it certainly is essential. I don't think we should downplay the need to prepare and plan for this, in part because it's not quite as the pace of urgency as some of the earlier phasers, but the range and scope of what is going to be required to coordinate a recovery is what's intimidating. And so basically we start with, we're thinking about trying to get back to business. We want to open the shop again. And so our messages have to really focus on not only those goals, how do we do it, but more specifically, how do we get there? What are our tools? Where do I report to work if, in fact, flood damage, as the people in South Carolina will be coming to terms with in just a few days, my normal working place has been destroyed by a flood or a fire. I did find it very interesting with the UCC shooting. I listened to the very first press conference, and I saw the president of the institution say, we're going to close on Friday and reopen on Monday. And I said aloud to the TV at the time, no, you won't reopen Monday because it will still be considered a crime scene on Monday. And guess what? They finally had to come back out and correct that statement because they had not even anticipated the fact that they wouldn't get to decide when their building reopened. I mean, recovery phase communication, again, thinking about the UCC example, they've got everything from worried parents and grandparents to students who don't know when their classes will meet or where they will meet or when those offices and classrooms will be available. Many students couldn't even get their car off of campus. They eventually had to be towed to a separate place after they were inspected for involvement. There's so many levels of recovering to get back that I don't want to give this the short shrift. In fact, I don't think there's much risk of me over-dramatizing how many different ways, both short and long term, of how complicated it is. There's you know, nothing is simple, and that's particularly true when you're dealing with recovery. Nothing is simple. There's regulations, there's health code, there's legal restrictions, there's so many different moving parts of this. So when I say you need to plan for your communication during the recovery, it is essential that you get as many of the nuts and bolts and the roadmaps established and anticipate the detours and the obstacles so that you will actually be able to more quickly and promptly say things. I didn't even mention, HR questions and things about what happens for coverage and compensation, and if my insurance doesn't cover the fact I was shot on your campus, where do I go and what do I do? So many questions, and they all have answers, but the question is, are you prepared to communicate to the media and to parents and to regulators and building code inspectors and everything else? And that's really the challenge.
Bob, just to jump in for a second, you said something there that's very, very important. And we're going to talk about that in another webinar later this month. Is this crisis your crisis manager's first crisis? The fact that you already knew that that school wouldn't open on Monday gave you an advantage in planning the messages, because once you put the wrong message out, getting it corrected becomes very complex, and you lose credibility from a leadership standpoint. So I think that it's easy to think this is going to be an easy phase, and you just whipped off 4 or 5 things that said this is going to be a little more complicated than you might think. And the way you make up for that crisis manager, that this is in fact their first crisis, is to think all through this process in advance, to have a plan at each stage and have message maps predetermined, have your key factors, establish what you're monitoring so you would know, because this one is much more complex, and your next slide where you start to begin talking about the long haul, I think really drives that home.
No, you're absolutely right, Jim, and that's where it's vital to work out some of these calculations in advance. You should not be trying to figure out when you'll be able to reopen a building. I mean, that's a discussion to have with law enforcement, with your insurers, with your cleanup crews, your restoration recovery crews, your psychological counselors. That should have been a roadmap plan, and you should have been able to lead with it, not only in the press conference, but that kind of information is what you need on websites, social media. You need a coordinated communication plan so it doesn't look like you're being surprised as what it looks like here. Now, I'm first of all incredibly sympathetic. I would, my heart goes out to what a institution administrator has to get up and do that. I'm not even really sure that press conference is the best place to make that announcement. So I'm saying this very sympathetically. I'm not being critical, but it is that's a place you want to shine. That's a place where you want to say, we've got plans for this. We've got our 800 number set up on the website. We're going to update information. We want to reopen as soon as we're legally and physically able to do so. But we also want to make sure we want to reopen as soon as our students, staff, faculty are able to do so. And so, I mean, there ought to be some planned messages. You're absolutely correct. And you ought to know the information in advance. You should not have to be discovering it. And you're right. This is for the long haul. Look, this is my sad news, I have to say, for people who are in the southeast today dealing with 8 to 10 to 12 feet of floodwaters in their offices, buildings, and homes and schools. This is not something you bounce back from in 2 or 3 days. Recovery on the multiple levels is a very, very, very long period. Some people might even say you never fully recover from events, and maybe that's a metaphor, maybe that's dramatic pause. But the reality is that by the time you deal with physical reconstruction, with psychological reconstruction, with just operations changes, close roads and down infrastructure, this phase, the life cycle stage of a crisis of recovery, can in fact be one of the most lengthiest periods that you should really plan for, and that means planning for communication that's sustainable, having multiple platforms, multiple channels, having your messages mapped out, not overlooking key audiences. I think this is one where, again, doing your homework, drawing upon experience and putting plans into place is absolutely essential. Bad communication in stage 6, poor communication in stage 6, not only prolongs the recovery, it delays it, it complicates it, and in some cases it hinders moving forward. And that's really kind of the thing. The complexity, I don't want to be over dramatic, but you think about everything from supplies to replacement, repair, insurance, the legal dimensions, the regulatory dimensions. And if you get human people involved, the counseling, the support, as well as procedural issues, it really stacks up. And to orchestrate fully a recovery from an event, whether it's a suicide in an office or school, to a mass shooting, to a flood, to a fire, it doesn't matter. They're all complicated. None of these things are simple and, oh, we just come back to work the next day and everything's fine. And in terms of questions and information needs and coordinating with all of your suppliers, your vendors, your constituents, it's really challenging. So the focus here, to make this clear, let me cut through all of that. The focus is to figure out how in the aftermath of some very disruptive event, be it an emergency, an incident, a disaster, crisis, whatever you want to categorize it, to get back to your normal operations. And so overcoming the residual challenges, whatever the new problems are, you don't have a building, you don't have your IT system, you have people who are hurt, and you have workers who are in the hospital, or you workers who are at their own homes. They can't come into work because they're dealing with their home floods. There's lots of things here. So how do you get back to operations? What's your communication plan for coordinating all of that? Now, all of you probably say, well, we have a repair service, and we have this or that. We've got, those are great. I think you should have them on call. I think in some ways you should work with your insurers to make sure that you've got resources available that you can draw upon, but you better have a plan to communicate all that. If not, you will have rumor, distortion, confusion, misinformation. It's a demotivator. It will produce confusion. None of it is simple. It is actually a complicated orchestra to get things back up and running fully. If you have better partners, that's even helpful, and that's great, and you have those with experience, but it is not a simple thing, and it should not be treated as such. So, very simply, so your plan is going to be different, right? So if you've had a fire or flood, tornado, pandemic, shooting, poisoning, I don't know, whatever it is, your recovery plan is different. And so I don't have time in today's webinar to go through every possible recovery plan. That's a different set of webinars. Your communication plan for whatever your plan is what today's focus is. And so obviously the nature of the event and the recovery will determine quite a bit of this. But typically what you're going to find is that a lot of things will be different, and people will, we use words like the new normal and in the aftermath, and people have changed and expectations have changed, and we'll never do that again, or we'll make sure that we do that next time. And I think that's part of it, because I don't think you approach this phase assuming that everything is now as it was or should be as it was. I think you have to come at this and recognize that you're looking at something that I call the way it is now. And so given everything that's transpired, what is the plan forward, and how do you reassure people? How do you motivate them? How do you get them the information you need? What tactics, what channels, what messages? Frankly, something as simple as just reintegrating people back into the normal flow of things can be challenging. So successful recovery phase communication must take what I'm just generally referring to as change circumstances into account and adapt. And that means that, again, you can't just say, well, we'll just go back to our normal procedures and we'll wait till a little note on the bottom of their next pay stub. That is not what you can do. So here's the issue. So recovery stage of an event is very broad, very complicated, and of course it's interconnected. And depending upon the nature of it, it can take a long time, and some say never, completely restored the way things were prior to the episode or event. But more significantly, you're still trying to get to the point where you're back functional. You want to be operational. You've got to get back to your mission, and there are some things that are mission critical, and you've got to get those up and running, but eventually you want everything back in concert working. And so your communication plan should align with your recovery plan. So communicating then helps people either repair what's broken, restore people, restore operations, and helping answer questions. So what next, what now? And you've got to be prepared to answer those. And I think that's where having that experience in advance, I really do. And Jim, you really hit upon a good point. The fact that you should have enough situational awareness and event knowledge to realize that you were not going to be able to reopen a campus after 10 people had been gunned down and murdered on it, on a Thursday evening, to be saying you're going to reopen Monday morning. I think you should have known that. So here's the question. What would have been the right communication, and where should people have gone for it, and to see that plan up into place? Recovery communication processes, no matter what your recovery aspects, are inherently a multitask, overlapping, interdependent series of ways of getting the word out. And of course, you got this very audience. And so there are people right now in South Carolina that are worried of everything from where are they going to sleep tonight if their homes are flooded and the motels are flooded, to what happened to their paycheck this week and what kind of insurance coverage they have. I can imagine so many questions. And we'll have different priorities of them. And so we tend to think of, I teach in my classes on this kind of a Maslowian hierarchy, Abraham Maslow's hierarchy, that we need to address these needs in an ascending order from most basic to most complicated. So when we look back, we take a step back, take a breath. In some ways, the final stage of a crisis life cycle demands some of the most complex and integrated communication as any of the stages. People will say, well, Bob, isn't stage 4 the most complicated? You got so much going on trying to manage an event. And I say, yes, it is complicated. Is recovery more complicated? I don't know. It is equally as complicated in terms of so much is going on, with the possible difference of there is a shifted sense of urgency. By the way, if you're trying to get mission critical things back online, there is still a sense of urgency in recovery communication. Don't let me mislead you to think, oh, we're all calm sitting around sipping coffee wondering who we should talk to. In fact, most people will be demanding do it faster, do it quicker, do it better, and so as we go through it. But this could be a very long time that you have to sustain this. In fact, I guess sustaining it is one of my takeaways here. This is an exhausting part of it. There are so many. This is the double aspirin part of this whole thing in terms of trying to get back to whatever the new normalcy is going to be, and that every obstacle that leaps up and every problem and every rumor that appears and every misunderstanding, oh, I thought you needed 10 cots, not 1,000. I didn't notice the other 2 zeros. There's so many things here that I think really leave us to the part of knowing it. And I have almost gotten to the point now when I think about the crisis life cycle that I see this more as a cyclical event, not linear. I should probably change my graphic that we used when we started today's session, because I think more and more recovery communication phase is really almost moves inherently into that period between the crises. And so recovery communication is really often preparation or pre-crisis communication for the next event. And that's certainly true with readiness, getting people to lessons learned. And there's a lot of things here that we really see this now as a full cyclical event. So so if you're if you're working right now with your team going, well, what is it we have to be communicating to whom? Here's your basic question. So you've got a recovery going on for a category of event or a common hazard. All right. So in it, you don't have access to your building: fire, flood, smoke, police lines. What needs to be communicated? Where do people go? When? Who do you need to let know? Is it your customers? Is it your employees? Is it your vendors? Your delivery schedule? Is it your students? Is it your patients? What about transportation? What about these? Who gets this information? And who is the source of it? Who should it be coming from? And by the way, from what means and what modality? And what is the timing of these things? One of the things we've talked about in the other stages of the crisis life cycle is that communication that comes too early or information too early is not used. Information that comes too late is mocked. When do people need this? When will I be interested in knowing about the change in my sick leave, and was that deducted from my sick leave account when I was out when the police ordered me off campus, or is that from my annual leave, or who's covering that? And these may not seem the questions you want to answer in stage 4, and they're not. These are the questions you want answered by stage 6. So how are you doing this? What are the key questions and what are the key answers? And if you don't know these things, then how are you going to tell people you're working on? What's your communication plan to say, we have to find that out? We don't know yet what we're doing accounting-wise, or we don't know yet where the counselors will be located, or how do you schedule an appointment with the counselor? You'll see a lot of people stand up in the recovery and say, oh, we've made counselors available. And that's probably for the general media a wonderful statement. But there's a long list of people that want to know, when do I go? How do I get there? How do I get in? How do I register? How do I cross the police line to get somewhere? They're going to be coming to places they've habitually gone which may not be available. So walk this through. What are the key questions? What do we do if the floodwaters have eliminated our place of business? What's the alternative site? How do I know where the alternative site is? When did that get activated? And everything that goes with it. What schedule will I be on? What time do I show up? Are we on skeleton crew? Am I paid the commuting cost? I can't even begin to think how many questions Will my payroll be automatically direct deposited? Or I normally get a paycheck and the building's destroyed. What does that mean? You need to work through the whole Maslow hierarchy and get down to fundamental needs and work your way up to the higher order questions. And you need to have a communication plan that not only coordinates the event, it gets the deliveries to the right place at the right time so we can start repairing and unloading the wood and nailing it up. But it also reassures people and provides a sense of control and confidence. So in stage 6, in the recovery phase, I usually focus on 4 key functional areas when I work through teams and they say, well, Bob, what do we talk about? I said, well, let's at least put 4 different white papers or whiteboards or tear sheets up on the wall. Let's list 1 production, let's call 2 physical, let's call 3 procedural, and let's call 4 psychological. So what are those 4 functional areas that you need a communication plan for? So production recovery is my catch-all for basically getting the shop back up and running. What's your mission? How do you get back to doing it? That's really simple. Production recovery probably has a lot to do with supply chain, data, information. Obviously, a hospital has a different production recovery goal than a school does, and which has a different one than a manufacturing plant does. But every organization, every business, every company, every association, every school should be able to tell me what their mission critical production goals are and tell me how they're going to communicate to get it. They got to have new supplies, and they've got to throw away the fish that was in their freezer and get new fish to start cooking it if you're running a fish restaurant. I mean, it gets down to very basic things. And they got to have gas to run the stoves, and they've got to have clean plates, and they need water again, and they need staff. And so if I'm doing a recovery communication for a fish restaurant, I have a pretty clear list, and you should be able to for your company and your business, your school, or hospital. So production, how to get whatever it is we do mission-wise back up and doing it. The second aspect is what I call physical recovery, and physical recovery is stuff. It's buildings, it's tools, it's equipment, it's space, it's computers and IT systems, and so physical recovery will be very different. Obviously, if you're today listening to this webinar and floodwaters have drowned your building, you've got a whole list of physical questions. If a fire has come, if there had been an Ebola outbreak and you've got a quarantine area, I mean, all of these things say, where do we need in terms of space, tools, equipment, things, stuff, supplies. So how do we get this back? We need raw materials in the door. We need places to store them. We need a lock that works on our doors after they've been kicked in. Stuff, physical recovery. How do you get that back to operations? Heating, air conditioning, ventilation, infrastructure, physical recovery. We need power back. Power's down. We need the generators working. Recovery communication, and the second goal and function is have to do with getting physical things back up. Number 3, the third key function during the recovery communication are what I call procedural or process recovery. So think about all the processes involved that have probably been not dealt with much during the active crisis management phase. You probably haven't worried too much about performance appraisals and HR paperwork, and in some cases, when the gunman's shooting up your building, you're not thinking about payroll processing, or you shouldn't be. But now we're in the recovery phase, and suddenly these questions are there. What is my work schedule? When do I come back? Where do I report? How will this time be treated? There's things I didn't get done that were considered urgent before, and now we've missed the deadline. Where do we go next? Who's in charge? Who's making these key decisions? In a sense, it's a triage of processes. What processes have to get back up and running? Sales calls have to be made. Travel arrangements have to be done. You may have people commuting because of temporary housing. You may have to make, okay, it's complicated. I think I made that clear. So procedural and process recovery, how to get your processes back that support the whole infrastructure and the side work, the undergirding of your operations. The fourth function that has to happen in the recovery phase is what I'm going to say basically is people recovery. I get criticized for that word. Some people hear it as body recovery. That's not what I'm saying. Psychological and emotional recovery. Look, every event, no matter how severe and widespread, from 9/11 to a fire in an office, has some deleterious impact on individuals, and the closer connected you are. I've done a lot of work recently looking at all of the physiological and psychological impacts that traumatic events and high stress events have on people. So how do you get the people back? There are many times, a lot of you have through your insurer, through a group like Firestorm, they have arranged for you to have a counseling team show up. Again, how do we get those two people? How do we get them connected? How do we get them through whatever trauma they've experienced, and how do we anticipate the echoes and the lingering effect of post-traumatic events and things? And some of it is very simple. It's getting them back so that they've met their own needs, that they're sufficient to come back in and begin doing fulfilling work, useful work and productive work again. And it's that simple. So 4 key functions with it. And that's what you've got to plan for. That's what your whiteboard should be right now. If you're working on this and you're following today's webinar to kick off your planning phase for your communication plans for recovery. Your target audience, again, are going to vary. Couple of key things I'll just give you as a takeaway. Tailor your messages for your audiences. Understand who you're talking to. Identify each of the audiences for different aspects for recovery. And obviously, coordination, command, control issues become it, supplies, vendor schedules. And there's some stuff you should be able to do. And I think this is really an excellent place for your planning purposes. This is not a process that somebody should be sent off, work at your own desk, come back with a list for us. This should be a brainstorming exercise. In fact, that's one of the things I enjoy doing, is sort of challenging and provoking people to think about. So who would you have to contact? Where did that come from? Who delivers those supplies? How would they know that that loading dock is closed? Who have you notified them? How do they find out? Do they know to check? And an answer, well, we hope they've heard it on the media, is not usually a good answer. I do think, and I will recommend, that this type of, as all of the stages, I guess my recommendation is for all the stages. If you've not been through this yourself, if you don't have that experience, please learn from others who have successfully managed each phase of a crisis life cycle, that have gone through communicating during each stage, because there's so much you can learn, and that's certainly true in the recovery phase. So in stage 6, people who have put things back together after they're blown all over creation, those are the people whose advice you might really want to listen to. I do think you have to have a consistency of messages, and we use words like stay on message, stay on topic. This is now a chance where people are looking for someone to be competent, to be professional, establish your protocols, follow it, be reliable, be dependable, be a trusted, credible source. And one way you do that is address these questions that arise. You should understand who you're communicating with and what their needs are. And by the way, it's not a time to tell them they really don't need to know that. You're going to have to address it in somehow, some ways. Consider a mix of push-pull communication methods. Use different modalities. You use your social media. Use your website. A lot of things you can do in the recovery phase that you can let technology be your assistant in terms of doing it. And I think that's very important to find that right mix. So consistency, I think, is very important. So our goal in recovery is to deal with confusing chaos, with complexity, and so many needs that people will have, as well as your own mission-critical goals. So the objective is that in this phase, we want to get back to whatever our new normal or our normal operations are, and talk about the next event. Now, I will put in a plug. Somewhere during recovery communication, you must analyze not only your event, how your plan worked and things, but analyze your communication. So look at your crisis management, look at how well prepared you were, find those gaps, get that list of lessons learned, but don't stop there. So many groups I work with have wonderful little reports. I call them after-action reviews. Jim has a hot wash sort of analogy. It doesn't matter to me what metaphor you use, but don't just write them down and say, yep, should have done that differently. Close the loop. Close the loop. How are you going to make sure that doesn't happen the next time? And don't say, well, there won't be another next time, because we're sure there'll never be another flood, there'll never be another tornado, there'll never be another hurricane, there'll never be another school shooting. That's so horrific. I can't imagine another one happening. Yes, and so tell me how you're going to do it better next time. And actually, that has to be part of the whole plan for recovery communication. Where are you getting the feedback, the input? Are you using this individually, or you got groups? Are you debriefing? Do you have a formal after-action review process, which I recommend, by the way? Bring in a facilitator, go through it. Not only write up the report, but follow through. close the loop on doing that, because really recovery communication is truly the gateway for planning for the next event. And this is your groundwork. What is the old thing about, don't fail to learn the lessons that are there to be learned. That's very important. So stage 6, so we went from the start of this, if you remember, to where we just had an inkling that something was about to go bad. And we talked about warning communication. We talked about getting people to begin a transition, shifting to the potentiality of a threat risk, shifting to an incident, and then managing that incident. So now we're at the other end, or the other side of this cycle. So now we're making a transition, not to get them aroused and motivated and alerted. We're trying to get them making a transition back to recovering from whatever happened, and building resiliency in our systems and operations for whatever is going to happen next. And that's really the best capsule I can give for recovery. Be prepared to communicate as you not only seek to recover your operations, production facilities, equipment, business processes, and people, but that you're really transferring us into whatever this new normal is, and hopefully we're stronger. And I know there's an old adage, I don't know if it's true or not, but whatever doesn't kill us makes us stronger. And I would like to think somewhere there's a metaphor that if we have endured and survived, and we can learn from it, we can lick our wounds, we can make ourselves stronger, we can get better prepared for the next event, then in fact we are going to be in a stronger position, an enhanced position, when we're back to now saying we've got a warning that something's coming. Our radar or sonar have triggered an alert. There's an online discussion that something might be going on. Our situational awareness tips us off. Let's put stuff into place. The danger is that we reel from event to event and people really get fatigued, and that's a whole other webinar that you can do that. And I'm really hopeful, fingers crossed, that once you've recovered from an event, that you've got a nice, long, stable period to get ready for the next thing, and that it's not something that will happen. But, if the Southeast had been hit by this hurricane right after this record flooding, I assure you we would not have had much time for recovery from the flooding before the winds of the hurricane and the storm surge from the hurricane made itself known. And so it is possible that there's not a long, long stretch between them, though I wish everyone that. So we're trying to get to the new normal. Jim, does that help get us to a place where we can talk about
where we go from here? Yeah, I think that's a great place to go, Bob. And I want to thank you again for doing the 6-part webinar series for everyone. I think it put the crisis in perspective and broke it down into manageable units. And if you're listening to the webinar today, I have a request for you to let us know what you would like to hear Bob share about crisis communications next. We've got lots of options and directions we're going. We had talked some earlier last month on crisis communications and a cyber breach, and Bob and I, before the call, were talking about that subject again. And every one of these things, there are nuances and there's directions that we need to go as we focus. So you can use that as a drop us a note on to firestorm.com, or you can use the little comment section in the toolbar up on the right to type in an idea or a description of what you'd like to hear in another session. This was an integrated package. By the way, they've all been recorded and are available through our website, and you can share those with individuals within your company to have a better understanding of what needs to be done. So recommendations, I think I could summarize a lot of what we've been saying here about predict, plan, perform. Predict what can happen, what kinds of messages would we need, what would the impacts be, how are we going to monitor them, what are the triggers that would cause us into action. And our plans aren't just the physical actions and responses, they're the communications, as Bob has talked so clearly about over this 6-webinar series. And then finally, perform. And he gave you several good pieces of advice today, and I want to go back. First, you've got to practice this. You need to run an exercise where the communications are integrated with the performance actions that you want to take and do. That's very critical. It's not the time to try to discover it in the middle of the crisis. And picking the cars up at the college after the shooting is a great example of that, or opening the college up and understanding each of those things. And one of the differences, I think, about all the plan and predict work that's done, it has to be focused not only on the what you do, but the how you do it. And that's where the testing of the exercises becomes so critical. And then the hot wash, what are the lessons learned? And Bob, I like your shift now to make this more of a continuous improvement process as it goes through, and I think they do build on it. So I would encourage you to think about the crisis communications area in predict, plan, and perform. Now, do you want to know what will happen tomorrow? And I think that the answer is, yeah, we do. And particularly when we think about crisis communications, Bob gave you a lot of insight here about what's going to be happening based upon where you are, which one of the 6 stages that you're in, and focusing on what people need to know. And then the monitoring, so you've got that feedback loop. Is your message getting out? What are other people saying about it? How does this affect my brand and reputation? How does it affect the safetiness of my people? In understanding each of those. There are some opportunities that you should think about within your organization. Up on the Firestorm website now, there are 2 virtual exercises from a cyber breach standpoint. And so that virtual exercise, the next ones of those we're doing, it's going to be on December the 8th or the December the 14th. We'd had a request from the last set of exercises that everybody wanted advance notice, so here's your advance notice. And the reason why there's 2 dates selected, that way if there's a conflict in your schedule and you couldn't do it on the 8th, but you could do it on the 14th, you still have that capability. So it will be repeated live on the 14th. It'll be done on the 8th and the 14th. And I think you're going to see some interesting things about cyber breach as you go through that particular exercise. We would encourage you to align your plans to best practices. Everything that Bob's been saying has been sharing with you the best practices from a crisis communications plan. If you are unsure, that's an opportunity for you to reach out. We'd be glad to help you. In fact, we'll try to talk to everyone on our call today. Create an intelligence network. If you don't have a way to monitor what's going on, if for every one of the vulnerabilities and threats that you've identified, your hazard matrix, it becomes so very, very critical. And then finally, to schedule some coaching to assist in that process, that's also available. There will be a brief on today's webinar. It's the 6th in that series, and you can get all 6 of those. And again, you can go to the Firestorm site and be able to download that. It should be up in the next few days. Candace pulls those together for Firestorm, and obviously we waited for the recording of today's session to be done. We're in a situation now, and Bob and I just got back from the DRJ, and we were talking there, and I talked about a little bit of a new term, and that's visibility, vulnerability. And there are 2 aspects of that I'd like to leave you with as we think about this 6th stage of crisis communications. When you find yourself in a crisis, you have visibility. We're often asked, could you get someone on Meet the Press or Face the Nation? And Firestorm has done that in the past in crisis. If you find yourself in the middle of crisis, getting on the media is not going to be your challenge. Not getting on the media might be your challenge, but the other one isn't. Because when you're in an elevated area where everybody is focused on you, if you were the president of that community college, you know what? Everybody's looking and hanging on every word. And the example that Bob gave about, well, we're going to be open on Monday, now you're going to say, well, no, not really, and it puts you at a disadvantage. Be aware if you find yourself in a crisis, you have a vulnerability caused by the visibility that's caused. By the way, that should go into your hazard matrix. It should go into your vulnerability analysis and be addressed. There's a second component of vulnerability visibility, and that is, what is your ability to see and predict what's going to come next? If you haven't established that intelligence network, you're going to have that vulnerability in coming together. If you've got questions about today, you can go to firestorm.com. You can go to send us an email at webinars@firestorm.com, or you can call us at 800-321-2219. Bob, thanks for sharing all of the great information over the last several weeks and months as we've gone through this series. Any last words of wisdom that you want to share today?
Yeah, I'll just be real simple and straightforward. Communication matters. I don't think you manage an event or recover from a disaster or survive an incident unless you communicate well. So communication matters.
Good summary, and Bob and I and Bill and Karen and the rest of the team all hope that you don't have a need for the things that we're talking about. Unfortunately, our experience is you're going to have a need. It is unlikely that we'll go through a year without having an event. Whether the crisis is large or small, it's going to have an impact. How you communicate may well determine if there's going to be a second crisis within your business. So thank you again. We appreciate you for the series, Bob. Travel safely. I know you're out defending the world in Kansas City. That seems kind of rough and scary just on the surface. Head on back, and we'll see you soon. And by the way, if you'd like Dr. Chandler to work with you and your company, let us know. He's available to help. He's will be in the States for a little while. He's just back from China, heading to Austria soon. So he's in demand. We'd be glad to work together with you. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day. Goodbye.